the sound she'd forgotten. It was 11:47 p.m. on a rainy Wednesday when the silence finally broke. Not the silence of the storm that had been building for hours, rain hammering the tall windows of the Ashford estate in long, furious sheets, lightning fracturing the sky above the Hudson Valley in white, surgical bursts. That silence was ordinary, expected. Eleanor Ashford had learned to work through worse. It was the other silence, the one that had lived inside these walls for 2 years, 3 months, and 9 days. The silence of a house where a child no longer made any sound. Eleanor was at her desk on the second floor when she heard it. Her fingers were moving across 3 keyboards simultaneously, the particular practice chaos of a woman running a $38 billion logistics empire from a home office at midnight because sleep had become a foreign country she no longer knew how to visit. 2 monitors displayed real-time freight data from terminals in Charleston and Rotterdam. A third showed the draft of a hostile acquisition filing her attorneys needed by 6 a.m. The fourth, the one she never turned off, never minimized, never looked away from for longer than she could help, displayed the live security grid for the Ashford estate. 94 cameras, every hallway, every garden path, every room. She watched it the way other mothers watch their children breathe. The sound came through the audio feed at 11:47 p.m. from camera 17, the East Conservatory. It was small, a breath almost. A sharp, involuntary intake followed by something higher, something bright and uncontrolled and absolutely unmistakable to the one person on Earth who had spent 2 years, 3 months, and 9 days listening for it in vain. A giggle, her daughter's giggle. Eleanor's fingers stopped moving. She sat completely still for 3 full seconds. Long enough for the acquisition draft to time out. Long enough for the Rotterdam feed to cycle through 2 frames. Long enough for her heart to perform the specific, terrifying arithmetic of a parent who has been told not to hope and cannot help it anyway. Then she reached for the security hub with hands that were not entirely steady and pulled up camera 17. The Ashford estate occupied 380 acres of Hudson Valley countryside outside Rhinebeck, New York, a property that Architectural Digest had once described as the most deliberately beautiful private residence in the northeastern United States. The description was accurate and entirely beside the point. Eleanor had not commissioned the estate for beauty. She had commissioned it for walls. Thick ones, tall ones, the kind with motion sensors and reinforced glass, and a security team that rotated in 8-hour shifts and answered only to her. At 40, Eleanor Ashford was the kind of woman that financial journalists struggled to describe without reaching for weather metaphors. Formidable, relentless, a force of nature. She had taken the mid-sized regional shipping company her father had built across 30 years of grinding, honest work and transformed it through 15 years of aggressive acquisition and surgical restructuring into Ashford Global Logistics, one of the 5 largest privately held freight conglomerates in North America. She had done it in tailored suits and on 4 hours of sleep, negotiating across time zones with the focused, predatory patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing in any room was a person who had nothing left to lose. She had learned that lesson personally. 28 months ago, on a rain-slicked stretch of I-87 north of Albany, a commercial freight truck running brake-failed and overloaded had crossed the center line at highway speed and hit the passenger side of her husband's SUV head-on. Daniel Ashford, architect, amateur jazz pianist, the only person Eleanor had ever met who could make her laugh until she couldn't breathe, was killed on impact. In the back seat, her 6-year-old daughter, Maisie, survived. Physically, the Maisie who came home from Albany Medical Center 3 weeks later was not the Maisie who had left. The little girl who used to narrate everything. Her breakfast, her dreams, the internal politics of her stuffed animal collection, had gone somewhere Eleanor's money could not follow and her grief could not reach. Pediatric neurologists called it selective mutism compounded by acute trauma response. Trauma therapists called it dissociative withdrawal. Eleanor called it what it was, Her daughter had disappeared and left her body behind as a placeholder. She had spent $4 million trying to bring Maisie back, the best pediatric psychiatrists in New York and Boston, a trauma specialist flown in from London, a sensory integration therapy suite built into the west wing of the estate at a cost that would have purchased a Manhattan townhouse, equine therapy, art therapy, music therapy delivered by a Juilliard-trained therapist who drove up from the city twice a week and played Maisie's favorite songs in the room next to hers until Maisie stopped leaving when she heard them. Nothing. Maisie moved through the estate like a small, solemn ghost. She ate when prompted. She slept. She sat at windows and looked at things Eleanor couldn't see. She communicated in the barest possible vocabulary of nods and stillness, and the occasional pointing of a small finger. Eleanor had watched her daughter disappear and had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had built higher walls and worked harder and told herself that if she could not fix the person she loved most, she could at least make the empire strong enough to protect her. She had not understood until recently that this was not strength. It was a different kind of disappearing.
The
East Conservatory had been Daniel's room. He had designed it himself, a glass-domed botanical space connected to the main house by a stone corridor, filled with the specific plants he had grown up around in his parents' home in Savannah: gardenias, Confederate jasmine, night-blooming cereus. After he died, Eleanor had considered having it sealed. She had, instead, left it exactly as he designed it, a decision she could not have explained and had never examined too closely. On camera 17, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the security system's infrared overlay, Eleanor could see 3 figures. The first was a man she recognized as her groundskeeper, James Calloway, hired 8 months ago through her estate manager, currently residing with his 5-year-old son in the small stone carriage house at the northern edge of the property. He was sitting cross-legged on the conservatory's flagstone floor. He was holding an industrial work flashlight pointed at the white stucco wall. Beside him, in what appeared to be dinosaur pajamas, sat his son, and directly across from them, knees pulled to her chest, face tilted upward, eyes wide and luminous in the flashlight's spill, was Maisie. Eleanor exhaled slowly through her nose. What is he doing in the main house at midnight? Her hand moved toward the security alert panel. The direct line to the overnight team, 2 armed former law enforcement officers who rotated the perimeter every 40 minutes. One call and James Calloway would be face down on the conservatory floor in under 90 seconds. Her hand stopped because James Calloway was making shadow puppets, not random shapes, not the simple rabbit ears and barking dogs of childhood. His hands were moving with a specific, practiced rhythm. A bird with articulated wing feathers, a tree bending in an invisible wind, and then something more complex. A configuration of both hands, thumbs interlocked, pinkies extended, moving in a particular galloping motion that produced, against the white stucco wall, the unmistakable silhouette of a small fox. A dancing fox. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. She leaned so close to the monitor that her breath fogged the screen. The dancing fox and the moon. It was Daniel's story. Daniel's specific, elaborate, painstakingly developed shadow puppet sequence, created over months of patient practice when Maisie was 3 years old, refined until every gesture was precise, performed exclusively during thunderstorms because Maisie had been terrified of them, and Daniel had decided that the best medicine for fear was wonder. No one else knew those gestures. No one else knew the order of the animals or the specific way the fox's ears moved, or the moment when it stumbled and fell and made Maisie dissolve into helpless laughter every single time. Daniel had never written it down. It had lived only in his hands and in his daughter's memory. On the monitor, the shadow fox leaped toward its shadow moon, and Eleanor watched her daughter, her silent, unreachable, disappeared daughter, throw her head back and laugh. The sound came through the audio feed like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Eleanor pressed both hands over her mouth. The sob that tore through her was not quiet. She let it come. For 30 seconds, in the darkness of her office, with the acquisition draft timing out on her monitor and the Rotterdam feed cycling in the background, Eleanor Ashford wept with the specific, overwhelming relief of a woman who had just been handed proof that the person she was most afraid of having lost was still, somehow, there. Then she wiped her face and looked back at the monitor, at the man on the conservatory floor, this quiet, broad-shouldered groundskeeper she had hired without meeting, had seen from her window 100 times without registering, had dismissed as part of the machinery of the estate. Who are you, Eleanor thought? And the part of her that had built a $38 billion company from the ground up, the part that trusted nothing and verified everything and understood that the most dangerous surprises came from the people you had decided didn't matter, began very quietly to ask the right questions. The man who wore long sleeves, Eleanor did not call security. She sat in the dark of her office and watched the conservatory feed until James Calloway gently closed the flashlight, spoke quietly to his son, and walked Maisie to the interior door of the main house with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had done this before. He waited until he heard the latch catch on the other side. Then he took his son's hand, and the two of them disappeared into the rain. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat at her desk until 4 a.m. with the footage running on loop, the shadow fox leaping, Maisie laughing, the specific way James Calloway's hands moved through Daniel's gestures with a precision that was not approximate or accidental. It was exact. Muscle memory exact. The kind of exactness that required either a supernatural coincidence or a connection to her family that she had not been told about. By the time the first gray light of morning began to press against the windows, Eleanor had made two decisions. The first was that she would not confront James Calloway directly. Not yet. In her experience, the fastest way to lose the truth was to announce that you were looking for it. People who were hiding things needed to believe they were still hidden, right up until the moment you were ready to use what you knew. The second decision was that she needed Winston Park. Well, Winston had served 12 years as a counterintelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency before Eleanor had hired him away with a compensation package that her CFO had described, diplomatically, as aggressively generous. He was 51 years old, Korean-American, compact and precise, in the way of someone who had spent his career in rooms where imprecision had consequences. He did not raise his voice. He did not speculate. He delivered information the way a surgeon delivered a diagnosis, completely, accurately, and without the softening distortions of sentiment. Eleanor called him at 5:15 a.m. He arrived at the estate at 6 a.m. with a cup of coffee for himself and one for Eleanor, because he had learned in 3 years of working for her that she would not have thought to make any. She slid the tablet across the breakfast table without preamble. The screen displayed a still image from the conservatory feed. James Calloway's face in the flashlight's ambient glow, his expression carrying that particular quality Eleanor had been trying to name since midnight. Profound sadness, careful tenderness, the expression of a man visiting something sacred. Complete background, Eleanor said. Everything. I want it in 2 hours. Winston looked at the image for 4 seconds. 2 hours, he said, and left.
Yeah.
The 2 hours that followed were the longest Eleanor could remember since the weeks after Daniel's death. She changed her clothes. She drank the coffee. She stood at the window of her office and watched James Calloway move through the north garden in the thin morning light, methodically clearing storm debris from the flagstone paths with the unhurried competence of someone entirely at peace with the work in front of him. His son Owen, 5 years old, built like a small, determined linebacker, trotted behind him carrying a child-sized rake that he was deploying with tremendous enthusiasm and negligible precision. Every few minutes, James would pause and show him something: a worm uncovered in the turned soil, a spider's web pearled with rainwater, and Owen would crouch down and examine it with the complete consuming attention that small children bring to the world before they learn to look past it. Eleanor had watched this man from this window before. She had registered him as competent, unobtrusive, reliably present. She had not until now looked at him. She looked at him now. He was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt in August. She had noticed this before and attributed it to personal preference, to sunburn sensitivity, to the particular practicalities of grounds work. Standing at her window at 7:30 in the morning with the conservatory footage still cycling in her memory, Eleanor Ashford looked at those long sleeves and felt the first cold edge of a much larger question beginning to form. Winston returned at 8:22 a.m. He set the folder on her desk and remained standing. This was unusual. Winston generally sat. The fact that he did not told Eleanor before she opened the folder that what was inside it was going to change something. "You were right to ask," Winston said. "The man in your garden is not who he presented himself to be." Eleanor opened the folder. The first document was a medical license issued by the state of New York. The photograph showed a younger version of the man currently clearing storm debris from her flagstone paths, clean-shaven, wearing scrubs, projecting the particular confidence of someone who had worked very hard to earn the right to stand where he was standing. The name on the license read Dr. James Calloway Merritt. Eleanor looked up. "Calloway is his middle name," Winston said. "He dropped Merritt and used a version of his mother's maiden name to pass our pre-employment screening. Our vetting process for ground staff was insufficiently rigorous. I've already flagged that for correction." "What was he before?" "Pediatric trauma surgery, Columbia University Medical Center. He completed his residency at Johns Hopkins, fellowship at CHOP in Philadelphia, joined Columbia's attending staff at 31. By all accounts, he was exceptional. Recruited for 2 different department head positions before he was 35. Winston paused. "He lost his license 28 months ago." "Yay, the shorts." Eleanor's hand tightened on the edge of the folder. 28 months ago. "The date," she said. "Yes," Winston said quietly. The revocation was finalized on the same date as the accident on I-87. Eleanor set the folder down. She was very still for a moment. The specific stillness of someone absorbing information that is rearranging things they thought were fixed. "Tell me," she said. Winston told her. The freight truck that had crossed the center line on T-87 and killed Daniel Ashford had not come from nowhere. It had come from the overnight dispatch yard of a regional logistics contractor called Blue Ridge Freight Solutions, LLC, a company that, through a chain of 3 holding entities, was a subsidiary of Ashford Global Logistics. The driver had been on his 19th consecutive hour of operation, in violation of federal hours of service regulations. The truck's brake system had failed a Department of Transportation inspection 14 days earlier. The inspection report had been filed, routed to the subsidiary's compliance office, and quietly suppressed by a mid-level operations manager who understood, without being explicitly told, that halting a revenue-generating route over a maintenance issue was not the kind of initiative that was rewarded. The crash was not an accident in the sense that the word was typically used. It was the foreseeable consequence of decisions made by people who worked for Eleanor Ashford, in a company that bore her name, in service of margins that appeared on reports she had reviewed and approved. The legal team had understood this immediately. What followed was not a cover-up in the dramatic sense. There were no burned documents or coerced witnesses, nothing so operationally crude. What happened was more insidious and more characteristic of how large organizations protect themselves from the consequences of their own negligence. The subsidiary's connection to Ashford Global was obscured behind the holding structure. The driver's HOS violations were attributed to record-keeping error. The failed inspection report was reclassified as a preliminary assessment pending follow-up. And James Merritt, Dr. James Calloway Merritt, the Columbia-trained pediatric trauma surgeon who had been driving home from a 31-hour shift when he saw the collision happen directly in front of him, was transformed from a hero into a liability because Dr. Merritt had stopped his car. He had told his wife, Rebecca, to stay in the passenger seat and call 911. He had run to the wreckage. The SUV had rolled onto its side and caught fire at the rear quarter panel. The driver's door was crushed against the guardrail. The rear passenger door was jammed by the frame deformation. Dr. Merritt had used his elbow to shatter the rear window, cutting both forearms on the remaining glass, and had crawled into the burning vehicle. He had found Maisie pinned under the collapsed rear seat, conscious and screaming. It had taken him 4 minutes and 11 seconds to free her. The fire department's arrival report confirmed the elapsed time. During those 4 minutes, he had sustained third-degree burns across both forearms from the heat of the door panel he had to hold aside to reach her. When he finally carried her out of the vehicle, he had performed emergency spinal stabilization on the wet highway shoulder, and then because Maisie was thrashing in terror of the fire and the storm and the noise, he had done the only thing he could think of to hold her attention and check her pupillary response at the same time. He had made shadow puppets against the side of a parked ambulance. He had seen Daniel doing them through the SUV's rear window in the seconds before the truck hit. He had used the same gestures, imperfectly, improvised, reaching for the memory of what he had glimpsed, and they had worked. Maisie had gone still. Her pupils had tracked correctly. She had stayed conscious. The fire department had arrived 9 minutes after the collision. By that point, Dr. Merritt had been kneeling on the highway shoulder for 8 of those minutes, with Maisie stabilized against his chest, his burned arms wrapped around her, talking to her in the low, steady voice of a trauma physician keeping a patient present. He had not been able to reach Daniel. The driver's compartment had been fully involved in fire before he reached the vehicle. There was nothing to reach. Eleanor absorbed all of this without speaking. Winston had long since learned not to fill her silences. "What happened to him?" Eleanor asked. "After." Winston's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. While Dr. Merritt was on the highway shoulder with Maisie, a second vehicle, a rideshare driver who had stopped to help and lost control on the wet road, struck his parked car. Eleanor looked up. His wife Rebecca was in the passenger seat, Winston said. She was 7 months pregnant. She was killed on impact. The baby did not survive. The room was very quiet for a long moment. The medical board review, Winston continued, was initiated by a complaint filed by Ashford Global's legal department. The complaint alleged that Dr. Merritt had recklessly moved a spinal trauma patient without proper equipment, potentially exacerbating Maisie's injuries, and had interfered with emergency medical personnel upon their arrival. Winston paused. The complaint also alleged that his physical and emotional state at the scene, his wife had just been killed 50 yards away, raised questions about his fitness to have made medical decisions. "They used his grief," Eleanor said. "They used everything available to them," Winston said. The board review took 11 months. During that period, Dr. Merritt was suspended from practice. He lost his Columbia privileges. He lost his malpractice coverage. He spent what remained of his savings on legal defense. The board's final determination cited insufficient evidence to exonerate him fully and revoked his license pending a review that has not been scheduled. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. Below, in the north garden, James Merritt was showing his son Owen how to tie a young sapling to a support stake. His hands moving carefully around the tender bark, his scarred forearms visible where his sleeves had pushed up slightly in the morning heat. Owen watched with absolute trusting attention. "He's not here for revenge," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "I don't believe so," Winston said. Based on his search history from the estate's Wi-Fi network, which I have now reviewed, his primary digital activity over the past 8 months has consisted of Maisie's publicly available school enrollment records, pediatric trauma recovery literature, and children's gardening activity guides. He paused. He also has 17 saved articles about shadow puppet techniques. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. "He came to see if she was okay," Eleanor said. "He came because she was the only patient he saved that night," Winston said quietly. "And I think he needed to know if it had been worth it." Eleanor looked at her daughter's man. This stranger who had burned his arms to the bone, pulling Maisie from a fire that Eleanor's company had caused, who had lost his wife and his child, and his career on the same night, who had spent 2 years quietly rebuilding in the shadow of everything that had been taken from him, and who had asked for none of it back. She thought of the shadow fox leaping toward its moon. She thought of her daughter's laugh. She turned away from the window and picked up her coat. "Where are you going?" Winston asked. "To the garden," Eleanor said. What the fire left behind. The north garden was still wet from the storm. Eleanor walked across the flagstone path in the kind of deliberate silence that had nothing to do with stealth and everything to do with the specific, focused calm she summoned before the most consequential conversations of her career. She had walked into rooms containing hostile acquisition targets, federal regulators, and one sitting senator who had threatened to subpoena her financial records. She had never once walked into any of those rooms feeling what she felt, crossing the wet grass of her own estate toward a man kneeling in the dirt beside a 5-year-old boy, terrified, not of James' merit, of what she owed him. Oh, he heard her coming. She watched his posture change the moment her boots crunched on the gravel edge of the path. A subtle, full-body stiffening, the involuntary recalibration of a man who had learned that attention from the people above him in a hierarchy rarely arrived bearing good news. He set down the twine he had been working with and rose to his feet in a single, unhurried motion, wiping his hands on his jeans. He turned. He looked at her face, at the red-rimmed eyes, the absence of the tailored composure she wore like a second skin in every photograph he had ever seen of her. And she watched him understand, in the space of 3 seconds, that she knew. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. "Owen," James said, his voice remarkably steady. "Go inside and wash up. I'll be right there." His son looked up from the trench he was excavating with focused, muddy commitment. He registered Eleanor with a gap-toothed smile of complete, uncomplicated friendliness, the smile of a child who has not yet learned to read rooms, and trotted obediently toward the carriage house. James turned back to Eleanor. He did not offer excuses. He did not arrange his face into the performance of innocence that guilty people reach for reflexively. He stood with the still, accepting quality of a man who had already made peace with consequences and was simply waiting to receive them. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "I know why you're here. I crossed a line last night bringing Owen into the main house. Whatever you need to do, I understand. We'll be packed by this afternoon." Eleanor stopped 8 feet away from him. She looked at his forearms, the sleeves pushed up slightly from the morning's work, the scar tissue visible in the pale morning light, not the pink recent scars of a minor injury, the deep, textured, permanently remodeled skin of third-degree burns, the kind that took months to heal and years to stop hurting and never entirely stopped being visible. She had looked at those sleeves from her window for 8 months and seen a preference for warmth. She looked at them now and saw a fire. "Dr. Merritt," she said. The name landed like a stone dropped from a great height. James went completely still. The carefully maintained composure, the quiet, unassuming groundskeeper, the background character, the man who had made himself invisible in her world for 8 months, cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. His eyes changed. Something raw and hunted moved through them, there and gone in less than a second, replaced by a careful, measured blankness that she recognized as the expression of a person deciding, in real time, how much to give away. His gaze moved briefly toward the carriage house, toward Owen, with the involuntary, protective calculation of a parent assessing distance and exits. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since this morning," Eleanor said. "Winston ran your background at 6 a.m. A long pause. "Then you know why I'm here." "I know some of it," Eleanor said. "I want to hear the rest from you." James looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, out across the wet lawn toward the tree line, and something in his face shifted. The controlled blankness giving way, slowly, to something older and heavier that had been living underneath it for a very long time. "I wasn't supposed to be on that road," he said. "I had finished a 31-hour shift. I should have taken a car service. I was too tired to make good decisions." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot. If I had made one different choice that morning, Rebecca would have been home." she would have been alive. Or, Eleanor said quietly, Maisie wouldn't have been. James was silent. Tell me what happened, Eleanor said. All of it, from the beginning. Well, he told her. He told it the way trauma survivors tell their worst stories when they have finally decided to stop carrying them alone. Methodically, factually, with the occasional long pause where the words ran out and the silence had to substitute for what language couldn't hold. He told her about seeing Daniel's SUV and his headlights, and the truck coming across the center line, and the specific, terrible helplessness of watching a collision happen at highway speed with no time to prevent it and no way to look away. He told her about pulling over and telling Rebecca to stay and running toward the wreckage and the heat that hit him like a wall 20 feet from the vehicle. He told her about the rear window and his elbows and the glass. He told her about finding Maisie, pinned, screaming, the seat collapsed across her small legs, and the 4 minutes and 11 seconds it had taken to free her, and the way the door panel had seared his forearms every time he reached past it, and he had not stopped reaching because stopping was not something his training allowed him to do when a patient was reachable. He told her about the shadow puppets. I'd seen your husband doing them through the rear window right before the truck hit, James said. Maybe 30 seconds before. I don't know why I remembered it. Shock does strange things to memory. But when I had Maisie on the shoulder and she was thrashing, I needed to check her pupils. I needed her to hold still, and I needed her to stay conscious. And I tried it. I didn't do it right. I only caught a few of the gestures. But it worked. Yeah. He looked at Eleanor directly for the first time since he had begun speaking. She went still. She looked at the wall of the ambulance where I was making the shapes. Her pupils tracked perfectly. She grabbed my wrist with both hands and held on. His voice had not broken. Eleanor was not sure how. She held on, he said again quietly, the whole time. Eleanor's throat had closed somewhere in the middle of this. She was managing, through an act of will she would not have claimed to be capable of 24 hours earlier, not to fall apart in the middle of her own north garden. What happened to Rebecca, she said. Tell me that part too. James looked away again. The rideshare driver came through the police barrier. He said afterward that he couldn't see through the rain and the smoke. He wasn't charged. A pause. Rebecca was 7 months along. We hadn't decided on a name yet. We had a short list. The silence that followed had a specific particular weight. I'm sorry, Eleanor said. The words were completely inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were true, and because the alternative was silence. And she had lived in enough silence to know it solved nothing. James nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something because it was offered honestly, not because it was sufficient. The medical board, Eleanor said. You knew it was us. I knew it was Ashford Global's legal team supplying the testimony, James said. The subsidiary connection took me longer to find. I didn't have resources for that kind of investigation. I'm a surgeon, not a forensic accountant. A brief, humorless pause. Was a surgeon. Why didn't you go to the press? Eleanor asked. What our legal team did to you, the story would have... Owen was 18 months old, James said simply. A public legal battle against one of the 5 largest logistics companies in North America takes years and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and turns your life into a war zone. I had an infant. I had no income. I had no license. He looked at her steadily. I made a calculation. Owen needed a father who was present more than he needed a father who was right. Eleanor absorbed this in silence. So you came here, she said. I found the posting 8 months ago. Estate groundskeeper, on-site housing provided. He paused. I had no plan. I want to be honest about that. I didn't come here to confront you or expose you or take anything. I came because Maisie was the only patient I couldn't follow up on, the only one I'd never know the outcome for. And the not knowing was... He stopped, started again. She was the only life I managed to save that night. I needed to know if it had been enough. And when you saw her, Eleanor said, she was walking through the gardens like she was already gone, James said. like the lights were on and nobody was home. A pause. I'm a pediatric trauma surgeon. I know what prolonged dissociative withdrawal does to a developing brain if it isn't interrupted. I know what the research says about sensory and emotional re-engagement triggers. He looked at Eleanor with the direct, unguarded honesty of someone who has decided that the time for careful management of information is over. I also know that the thing that reached her on the highway shoulder was your husband's story. And I thought, if it worked once, under the worst possible circumstances, you thought it might work again, Eleanor said. I should have asked your permission, James said. I know that. I told myself I would find a way to... But every time I thought about how to explain who I was and why I was here, I couldn't find a version of that conversation that didn't end with you calling the police and Owen and me losing our housing. So I waited. And last night the storm was bad. And I could see from the carriage house that the lights were on in her room and I just... He stopped. I just couldn't not try, he said. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. She was looking at this man. This burned, grieving, quietly extraordinary man who had lost his wife and his child and his career on the worst night of his life and had spent 2 years rebuilding in the ruins and had come to her estate not to collect a debt but to check on a patient. And she was performing the specific, uncomfortable arithmetic of someone tallying what they owe. The number was not calculable. She reached into the pocket of her coat. She held out a set of keys. The brass master set for the main house, the one she kept in her desk drawer and had never given to anyone. James looked at them. The east wing has 6 rooms, Eleanor said. Owen can have the one with the window seat. He'll be able to see the garden. James stared at the keys. Ms. Ashford, Eleanor, she said, and before you say anything else, there is something I need to tell you. Something I didn't know until this morning, and something you deserve to hear from me directly. She told him about the subsidiary, about the brake inspection report, about the hours of service violations, and the compliance manager who had buried the filing and the legal team who had understood immediately what the connection meant and had moved, with practiced institutional efficiency, to ensure it remained buried. She told him that her company had caused the crash that killed his wife. She told him that her lawyers had known this and had used it, had turned his heroism into a liability and his grief into a weapon, and had destroyed his career to protect a stock price. She said all of it looking directly at him, without softening it or contextualizing it, or surrounding it with the careful qualifications that powerful people use to dilute accountability into something more comfortable to deliver. James took one stumbling step backward, then another. His face cycled through something that had no single name. Shock and grief and fury and a kind of terrible, clarifying recognition, as though a shape he had always sensed in the dark had finally stepped into the light and proven to be exactly as large as he had feared. He turned away from her. He grabbed the wooden support stake he had just finished tying and pulled it from the ground with a single, savage motion. The controlled, quiet man fracturing along every fault line at once, and hurled it into the tree line with a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders heaving, both scarred hands pressed flat against the wet bark of the young oak he had just staked. Eleanor did not move toward him. She did not speak. She let him have it. The rage, the grief, the 2 years of suppressed knowing that something had been done to him that he could not name or reach or fight because he had been too busy keeping Owen alive and keeping himself functional and keeping one foot in front of the other in the way that people do when the alternative is stopping. She let all of it come. When James finally turned back to her, his eyes hollowed out, his breathing ragged, the careful composure entirely gone, he looked at her with an expression she did not try to interpret. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "You could have kept it forever. I would never have been able to prove the subsidiary connection. Because hiding behind walls," Eleanor said, "is what destroyed us both." She held the keys out again. "I'm going to Manhattan tomorrow morning," she said. "I'm going to give everything I have to the DOJ and the SEC and every journalist who will take my call. I'm going to dismantle what my legal team built, and I'm going to make sure the people who did this to you answer for it in federal court." She paused. "It won't give you back what you lost. Nothing will. But it's what I can do, and I'm going to do it." She looked at him steadily. "I need someone to watch over Maisie while I'm gone. Someone who knows how to reach her." A pause. "Please." James looked at the keys for a long moment. He looked toward the carriage house, where Owen was visible through the small window, industriously washing his hands at the kitchen sink with the focused concentration of a child taking a task very seriously. He looked back at Eleanor. He took the keys. But soon, the boardroom on the 38th floor of Ashford Tower occupied the entire northeast corner of the building and looked out over Midtown Manhattan with the particular elevated remove of a space designed to make the people inside it feel like they were above the ordinary consequences of ordinary decisions. Eleanor had always found it useful. She found it useful now for different reasons. The board had assembled at 9 a.m., 7 directors, the COO, the general counsel Richard Farrow, and 3 senior members of the legal department who had been present for the decisions made 28 months ago and had, in the intervening time, apparently concluded that the statute of limitations on institutional amnesia was indefinite. Eleanor walked in at 9:03. She was alone. No Winston. No attorneys of her own. Just Eleanor Ashford in a gray suit carrying a single flash drive. She plugged it into the boardroom's presentation system. The screen at the end of the room, normally reserved for quarterly projections and acquisition decks, displayed a photograph of the I-87 collision site. Next to it, the DOT brake inspection report with its suppression timestamp. Next to that, the medical board complaint filed under Ashford Global's legal department letterhead. Richard Farrow's color left his face in a single, rapid recession. "Victoria," he began, using her first name for the first time in 11 years of working together. The reflexive intimacy of a man reaching for leverage. "You're clearly under significant stress. Before we—" "Sit down, Richard," Eleanor said. He sat. 28 months ago, Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily through the absolute silence of the room. "A truck operated by a subsidiary of this company caused a collision on I-87 that killed my husband. The driver was in his 19th hour of operation. The vehicle had failed a DOT brake inspection 14 days prior. This board's legal department knew both of these facts within 72 hours of the crash." She looked around the table. "Rather than disclosing this information to federal regulators, to me, or to the family of the man who ran into the burning wreckage to save my daughter, this legal department initiated a coordinated campaign to suppress the subsidiary connection, falsify the compliance record, and destroy the career of a pediatric surgeon named James Merritt, a man who sustained permanent injuries pulling my child from a fire that this company caused." The room was absolutely still. 30 minutes ago, Eleanor continued, I transmitted the complete contents of this flash drive, including Richard's off-the-books communications regarding the crash, the suppressed inspection report, the medical board complaint, and the holding structure documentation, to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and 3 journalists. Farrow lunged for his phone. The boardroom doors opened. 4 federal agents stepped in. "The building is in lockdown," Eleanor said over the eruption of voices. "There are warrants for wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and corporate manslaughter. You are not leaving this room." Richard Farrow looked at Eleanor across the length of the black walnut table with an expression of pure, concentrated hatred. "You've destroyed everything your father built," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "I'm just clearing the wreckage." She turned and walked out of the boardroom as the handcuffs came out. The Manhattan skyline, bright and indifferent, beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. The city 38 floors below, going about its morning entirely unaware that something had just been made right. What the light looks like now. The federal proceedings against Ashford Global Logistics moved with the particular grinding momentum of institutional justice, slower than Eleanor wanted, faster than Richard Farrow's attorneys had anticipated, and thorough in the way that federal investigations become thorough when the person who built the case hands them everything. Richard Farrow was indicted on 11 counts, including obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit corporate manslaughter. The compliance manager who had buried the DOT inspection report pleaded guilty within 6 weeks in exchange for cooperation. 2 members of the legal department followed. The subsidiary's operational director, who had knowingly dispatched an overloaded truck with a failing brake system driven by a man 19 hours into his shift, was arrested at his home in Westchester on a Tuesday morning and did not make bail. The proceedings took 14 months. Eleanor attended every day she was permitted in the courtroom. She sat in the third row behind the federal prosecutors, in the same gray suit she had worn the morning she walked into the boardroom with the flash drive. She did not bring attorneys of her own. She had already said everything she had to say in the form of the most comprehensive voluntary disclosure in the legal department's documented history. And she had said it clearly and on the record, and without the softening distortions of counsel. She was not there to manage the outcome. She was there because Daniel deserved a witness, and she was the only one left who could be it. Ashford Global Logistics survived. Barely, and differently, and in a form that would have been unrecognizable to the company Eleanor had inherited from her father, which was, she had come to understand, precisely the point. The board was restructured. The legal department was dissolved and rebuilt from the outside. 3 subsidiaries with problematic compliance histories were divested. The company's federal consent decree required independent oversight for 5 years, and a compliance infrastructure that cost more annually than the suppressed brake inspection had saved. The stock dropped 42% in the 6 weeks following Eleanor's disclosure. It began recovering in the 8th week when the Wall Street Journal published a profile of Eleanor that described her decision as the most consequential act of voluntary corporate accountability in the past decade. The piece ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, 2 of Ashford Global's largest institutional investors had increased their positions. Eleanor read neither the criticism nor the praise with any particular investment. She had stopped measuring herself by those instruments. James Merritt's medical license was reinstated by the New York State Board for Professional Medical Conduct on a Thursday afternoon in October, 14 months after Eleanor's disclosure. The reinstatement was not quiet. Eleanor had retained a communications firm specifically to ensure it was not quiet. The firm's instructions had been simple. Tell the true story, all of it. Don't manage it. Don't shape it. Tell it. The result was a 17-minute documentary segment that aired on a major network news program and was viewed in its first week online by 11 million people. The segment included security footage, with James's permission, of the conservatory on the night of the thunderstorm, the shadow fox, the dancing fox. Maisie's laugh. Eleanor had watched the segment twice in her office before it aired, and both times she had not been able to get through the conservatory footage without her composure failing her entirely, and she had decided this was acceptable. The Jonathan Ashford and Rebecca Merritt Foundation for Pediatric Trauma was established 6 weeks after the reinstatement, funded by an initial endowment of $180 million from Eleanor's personal liquidation of Ashford Global shares. Its mandate was pediatric trauma recovery services, with a specific focus on children from families without the financial resources to access specialized care. The families for whom the labyrinthine economics of the American healthcare system functioned as a second injury layered on top of the first. Its chief medical director was Dr. James Calloway Merritt. He had been Eleanor's first and only call for the position. His response, after a pause of approximately 4 seconds, had been, "When do I start?" The Ashford estate in the spring was a different country than the one Eleanor had inhabited for 2 years, 3 months, and 9 days. The velvet curtains in the main rooms had been replaced with linen. The conservatory, Daniel's room, the glass-domed botanical space that Eleanor had left untouched and unvisited for 2 years because entering it felt like pressing on a wound, had been opened up and reclaimed. The gardenias were blooming. The Confederate jasmine that Daniel had grown from, a cutting his mother sent up from Savannah, had spread along the south wall and was filling the room with the specific, warm sweetness that Eleanor had associated, without consciously realizing it, with every memory of being happy. On a Saturday afternoon in late April, the conservatory contained 4 people and a moderate amount of productive chaos. Owen Merritt, 6 years old now, recently opinionated about dinosaurs in a way that suggested Maisie had been a significant influence on his intellectual development, was constructing something structural and ambitious from a set of wooden blocks in the corner. His architectural ambitions consistently exceeded his engineering, which meant the structure collapsed every 12 minutes with a satisfying crash, and he rebuilt it immediately with undiminished confidence. Maisie was sitting cross-legged on the flagstone floor beside him, a large picture book open across her knees. She was reading aloud. Her voice, which had come back gradually, in the way that things return when they are not forced, word by careful word, across many months, had settled into a quality that Eleanor found herself listening for the way she had once listened for its absence. Clear, slightly serious, occasionally inflected with the particular dramatic emphasis of a 7-year-old who understood that stories deserved to be delivered with appropriate weight. She was reading Owen a story about a fox. He was only half listening, his attention divided between the narrative and his structural engineering challenges, but his half attention was comfortable and companionable, and Maisie did not seem to require more than that. Eleanor sat on the stone bench along the south wall with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold and a novel she had read the same page of 4 times without retaining it, which was fine, because the thing she was actually doing was watching her daughter read. James sat beside her, not close, not far. The specific, unplanned distance of 2 people who had stopped calculating distances and simply sat where it felt natural to sit. He was drinking coffee. He was wearing a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a thing he had begun doing somewhere around the 5th month of living in the East Wing, without announcement or ceremony, as though he had simply decided one morning that the scars were part of the story and the story no longer needed to be hidden. Eleanor had not commented on it. She didn't need to. Outside, the Hudson Valley was fully, extravagantly in bloom. The dogwoods along the North Drive white and luminous in the afternoon light, the gardens that James had spent 8 months redesigning coming into the first full expression of what he had imagined for them. He had rebuilt the East Garden entirely, replacing the formal topiary with a kind of structured wildness, native meadow plantings and old climbing roses, and a small vegetable bed that Owen tended with tremendous seriousness and mixed results. Daniel would have loved it, Eleanor thought. He had always believed that the best gardens looked like they were doing what they wanted. She added 3 new words this week, James said quietly, watching Maisie navigate a particularly complex sentence with focused determination. I know, Eleanor said. Her therapist called Thursday. She said Maisie is light years ahead of where the models predicted. The models don't account for Owen talking constantly, James said. It's basically immersive language therapy. He charges nothing and takes no appointments. Eleanor smiled. It was the specific smile that had started appearing sometime around month 3 of the new arrangement. Unguarded, involuntary, the kind that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. She had stopped trying to decide. James, she said. She asked me last night if your fox has a name. A pause. What did you tell her? I said I didn't know, that she should ask you. James was quiet for a moment, watching Owen's latest architectural effort totter and collapse, and watching Owen immediately begin rebuilding without breaking stride. Henry, James said. His name is Henry. That's a very dignified name for a dancing fox, Eleanor said. He's a very dignified fox, James said. He just has an undignified hobby. Eleanor laughed. Across the room, Maisie looked up from her book at the sound. She looked at Eleanor for a moment with those large, clear, fully present eyes. The eyes that were no longer vacant, no longer looking at something only she could see, but here, entirely here, taking in the room and the afternoon light, and the 2 adults on the bench, and her best friend rebuilding his tower in the corner. Mom, Maisie said, with the specific matter-of-fact authority of a 7-year-old who has decided something. "Can Henry come to my birthday?" "Henry the Fox?" Eleanor said. "Yes, Henry the Fox is a shadow," Eleanor said. "He lives on the wall." Maisie considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Then we'll need a flashlight," she said, and returned to her book. James made a sound that was almost a laugh, a short, quiet exhale of genuine amusement, and Eleanor felt it land somewhere specific and warm, the way things land when you have stopped bracing for impact. Later, after Owen had been persuaded that dinner existed and was preferable to further construction, and after Maisie had read 4 more pages and demanded that James perform the Henry sequence twice, the second time with the new hippopotamus that he had been developing for 3 months, and that still, he admitted freely, looked primarily like a confused potato, the conservatory emptied gradually into the warm April evening. Eleanor stayed a few minutes longer. She sat on the stone bench in the gardenia-scented quiet of the room Daniel had built, in the last of the afternoon light coming through the glass dome, and she allowed herself to simply be in the space without the protective distance she had maintained for 2 years and 3 months and 9 days. It still hurt. She had learned in the past 14 months that the things that matter continue to hurt, and that this is not a malfunction. It is the accurate response of a person for whom the lost thing was real. The goal was not to stop hurting. The goal was to build something true around the hurt, something large enough and alive enough that the grief had company. She thought of Daniel in this room, tending the gardenias. She thought of the specific way he laughed. She thought of him in the back seat of a car in a rainstorm, making a shadow fox dance against a window for a small girl who was afraid of the thunder. She thought, "You found the right person to carry it." She was not sure entirely whether she meant James or Maisie or herself, perhaps all 3. She stood up, turned off the lamp on the side table, and walked out into the hallway toward the sound of dinner being made and 2 children arguing companionably about whether hippopotamuses could dance, the gardenia scent following her through the door and into the living house beyond. The fortress was gone. In its place was something that did not have a cleaner name than what it was. A home where broken people had brought their broken things and found, without planning it, that the pieces fit together differently than they had before. Not perfectly, not without visible seams, but solidly, built to last. Sometimes the worst night of your life is happening to more than one person at the same time. Sometimes the thread that connects you to the person who needed you, or who you needed, or both, is thinner than you could ever have engineered on purpose. Sometimes it is a child's laugh through a security feed at midnight. Sometimes it is a shadow fox dancing on a wall in a thunderstorm. Sometimes it is the specific, terrifying courage of saying the true thing to the person who most deserves to hear it, even when, especially when, the true thing costs you everything. Pay attention to the people you have decided don't matter. They are often carrying exactly what you need. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that healing rarely looks the way we expect it to, and that the people who save us are sometimes the ones we almost didn't see, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We tell 1 story a week. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss one. Tell us in the comments, what moment in this story hit you hardest?